Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Health Babes podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Becky Campbell with Dr. Crystal Hohn. Today we have Alissa. She is the founder of MS. She has been diagnosed with the autoimmune disease, multiple sclerosis, and she went from being diagnosed or being labeled as aggressive MS with giant lesions on her brain to feeling pretty asymptomatic today. So she's going to walk us through her whole journey from her first symptoms to her diagnosis to what she did, the conventional medicine route to the functional medicine route and kind of where she is today with all of it. So let's welcome Alissa. Hey, Alissa, welcome to the show. We're so excited to have you on today.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about autoimmune disease and specifically MS. Alissa was diagnosed with MS, and she's going to kind of walk us through her story, and we'll get into some questions on that. So can you first start by telling us, what has your journey been so far with this? Like, how did you get diagnosed and kind of go from there?
Yeah, sure. So I was diagnosed in 2009. So probably about a little over 13 years ago, actually in August of 2009. So I spent the summer, unfortunately, through all the tests and everything, getting diagnosed. What tipped me off was actually I was working at Target at the time, and I had back surgery for a herniated disc about a year before. And I started having this weird electrical impulse that when I moved my head a certain way, like I would get a shooting electrical kind of zaps down my neck. And I was like, that's weird. Maybe this is just related to back surgery. So I made an appointment with my neurosurgeon, actually. I just never made it there. Because then I noticed that my eyesight was really blurry too. Because I had like little splotches, kind of like if you were wearing glasses, there's like watermarks on it. So I was like, that's weird. But obviously, since I was a 24-year-old stubborn person, the doctor was the last thing on my mind that I wanted to go to. So I waited probably 2 or 3 weeks. And then I was like, okay, my vision's not any better. So I should go get this checked out. And so I went to the eye doctor. So I was like, that's the first place to start. And he said, there's nothing wrong with your vision, but you should go get an MRI. And I was like, that's really like a big jump, but all right, fine.
Well, yeah. Did he walk you through that or like tell you why or
Nope.
no, just said, go get a MRI.
Yeah, he was like, you should go get an MRI like now. And I was like, all right, that's a little weird, but yeah, we'll do it. All right.
Yeah.
So I went and got an MRI, and we're like, he ordered it. And then he called me back saying that, okay, you don't have a brain tumor. And I was like, great. That's what you're looking for. Awesome. But you should go see a neurologist like today or tomorrow. And I was like, all right, so something is up here. So I went to a neurologist. He was like, oh, that's not very good. So I started the whole battery of tests. I had way more MRIs to kind of look at everything instead of just the optic nerve. So I did like the brain, cervical spine, and then thoracic spine too. I did a lumbar puncture, which was really not fun because usually I had back surgery like the year before. So I had a lot of scar tissue there. So what usually is like a 10-minute procedure was about an hour or more so. And it was just awful.
So did they see lesions on your MRI, and that's how they knew to do the puncture?
Yep. So I think the optic nerve was inflamed, which it was very, very inflamed. And so then they kind of kickstarted like, oh, go get all the other tests too. So lo and behold, he gave me a diagnosis of MS. At that time, also, I was in an abusive relationship. Like I had just gotten into that the year before. So it's not lost on me now, like the progression of this, how this happened. But at the time, like I was diagnosed and I was like, I can't manage this. Like I've got way bigger fish to fry. I'm in this relationship. I'm in grad school. I'm like doing all these other things. And I'm like, I feel okay. Like it was just my eyesight that was a little weird, like nothing else. So I was like, whatever. I went on the medication because he gave me like this giant stack of like medication pamphlets, like from the drug companies, like they're all like in these brochures and they're all fancy and stuff. So he gave me like a 3-foot stack high of medication information. He's like, here, just go pick one. And I was like,
one?
Oh, yeah, just basically pick one. Like there's no real direction. It was just like pick one. And when I found out later, like kind of working with him, like he was very much, I think his approach is very much like to join with the patient and kind of, and let them lead the treatment and all that kind of stuff. But I didn't really know that at the time. So I was like, okay, I'll pick one. And at that point in MS, like oral medications were like way down in the research pipeline. That wasn't even a thing. So it was all injectable medications at that point.
And when you're talking about injectable medications, I mean, I know, but for the listener, like what were they wanting? What types of things were they wanting you to take?
Yeah. So at this point, so way back when, there was kind of a few different, like only pretty much two different kind of types of them. So there was the interferons, which is the beta interferons, that was like Avonex, Rebif, all of those, like kind of the old ones. And then Copaxone, which was the glutamine acetate, which is a little bit different of a medication. But the side effect profiles and how you administer them is much different. So all of the interferons are usually like once a week, that kind of thing, that kind of schedule. But Copaxone at that point anyways was every day. But the side effect profile was vastly different. With all the interferons, it's like flu-like symptoms, like you feel like crap all the time. Yeah. But Copaxone had a much lower and smaller side effect profile. But the trade-off was you have to inject every day.
Wow.
So that's the one I picked, because I was like, I'm doing a lot of stuff. I don't have time to feel like I have the flu every day, because I don't feel like that now. Like I didn't really have that much impact. So I'm like, I don't want my medication to cause more side effects than the actual disease at this point. So,
which unfortunately it does, right? A lot of the time. Were the medication that they recommended supposed to kind of shut down the activity of the immune system, reduce inflammation?
Yeah. So at that point, it was just thought that all of those medications just slowed progression down a little bit, and they didn't know how at that point. But it was just like, yeah, they're just going to slow progression, kind of slow lesion formation and all those kind of things, and like symptom progression. So that was really the point of medication at that point, and probably still is now, like to kind of just reduce progression and reduce symptom burden, and then lesions obviously too.
Right. Yeah.
For sure. What else? So when you were diagnosed and they got you on the medications, what else did they tell you to do?
Not much else.
Right.
They didn't talk about diet, I'm sure.
No. So actually it was probably a few years later that my boyfriend then, like the abusive boyfriend, I got rid of. So then,
which is probably imperative to your treatment.
Absolutely.
Without you even knowing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Because you can't really heal in the environment where you got sick. And that was absolutely one of the, I credit kind of him and that relationship as the straw that broke the camel's back for me. Because I know, I kind of looking back through my life now, I can kind of pinpoint and connect some dots where I was like, okay, well, I was always sick in high school. I had EBV, like I had mono, like I could see like how this was forming like through my life. But then I think that just kind of tipped the scales for me. So obviously I had to get rid of him, but my boyfriend, I brought my new boyfriend, who now became my husband, to an appointment with me. And he was actually the one that asked. He's like, so is there anything else that she should be doing, like diet or anything? And like my neurologist literally went like this and was like, I think the Mediterranean diet's probably good for you. Like I've heard that's good.
Wow.
And I was like, okay, well, I'll look into that.
Yeah.
So like he didn't really give me any direction. It was just kind of go on medication and then just follow up and keep track of your symptoms and that kind of thing. So
yeah. So what really started leading you down this path then, and getting more into the approach that you use with the people that you help today?
Yeah. So I had found so totally separate of MS. I was working with a fitness coach at this time too, and she encouraged me to go gluten-free and just to like kind of see what happens, like cut out dairy for a little bit, kind of start this path of kind of moving towards a more paleo template, which she never talked about, but that's eventually what happened. So I found that I felt a little bit better without gluten, kind of started to feel a little bit differently in my body. So then I started to research stuff about like kind of in the fitness category, but then kind of looking at paleo, and then that brought me to finding the autoimmune protocol.
Okay.
And so I found that probably like 2012-ish, 2013. But at this point I was still living at home. I was still in grad school. I just started working. So I was still kind of trying to get up and out on my own. And I was talking to my mom about it. I remember that. And she was like, oh, that's so much stuff to give up. Like that would be so hard. So I was like, okay, like maybe I won't do that yet.
Yeah.
So I went on the medication and everything was like fine until like it wasn't one day. And I woke up with a major relapse, and I couldn't feel the right side of my body. And so there was that kind of started a whole relapse cycle for me of like 3 relapses in a year and a half, which is really fast for MS. My doctor was talking about aggressive MS, like it just kind of changed overnight and just kind of really progressed downward for me. Yeah. So I changed medication, like did all these kind of things to treat aggressive MS. But I was still feeling crappy. Like it only helped a little bit. I was still feeling really exhausted, really fatigued. Really a lot of pain was happening in my body. So I was like, something has to give here. So I was like, okay, let's go back to this autoimmune protocol idea. Let's see where I'm at. And I was pretty close at that point because I had given up a lot of stuff already. I was pretty close to paleo. So I was like, let's just do it.
Yeah.
So I think 2015 in January, I went full elimination AIP, I went the full thing and eliminated everything else that you have to eliminate. And I felt better, like all my fatigue, not all, but a lot of my fatigue and pain was gone probably within 3 or 4 months.
Wow.
So this just changed my perspective on everything. And I was like, wow. So if this little shift in me can have such an effect, like I need to help people with this too. Like I need to like talk to people about this. Like this kind of sparked the idea of like even just blogging at first, kind of like just sharing my patient story, like with other people. But then people just kept asking like, well, how do I do this? Like, can you help me? And then that's how my business was eventually born.
It's amazing how, you're put on these medications that come with side effects and you probably, you don't notice much of a difference. And then you just eliminate inflammatory foods basically from your diet and how quickly that can change things. Yeah. Yep. And it's so good too, because people like you are who people want to hear from, right? Absolutely. If you're a doctor who doesn't have this, you can only give so much advice, but that's what functional medicine, right? And whether you're a health coach to a doctor, it doesn't really matter. If you can share your experience and tell people what it was like for you and step by step what happened, it's so helpful for them. So we really love that you're, talking about this and helping other people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a much different thing because like you just said, like you don't get it until you get it, like right. So a neurologist can have like, he can understand, or like she can understand like their patient's perspectives and empathize with that, but like not fully, like you don't quite have that like understanding until unfortunately you get it. So
true.
So for those that are listening to, we can get a little bit more into diet because that's very overwhelming for a lot of, people when when we're talking about, anti-inflammatory or even paleo. A lot of people don't know what that means. So can you give more specifics of some of the core groups of foods that we need to be staying away from, and what type of diet do we need to be looking at if we're struggling with MS?
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to call, so what I did was the autoimmune protocol or AIP. And I like to call that paleo on steroids because it takes out everything that paleo does, which is like gluten, grains, soy, dairy, kind of those main groups of categories. But then it goes a little bit deeper.
Sugar.
Sugar, that's a big one too. But then you cut out like nuts and seeds, eggs. There's a few other like nightshade vegetables, like that's tomatoes, peppers, like those kind of things. So it takes it a little bit extra, because for some people, all of those types of foods can be inflammatory. So it's not like it is inflammatory, it can be inflammatory. So that's really the point of AIP, is to eliminate those at first and kind of calm your body down, but then reintroduce. Like that's the really big part that a lot of people miss, is the reintroduction part. So because you want to like the least restrictive diet possible. Because AIP like restricts a lot of stuff, possibly unnecessarily, if it doesn't react in your body, that's giving you lots of nutrients. So the reintroduction part is just as important as the elimination part, which I think a lot of people get either nervous to do, or like they're like, oh, I feel great on AIP, I don't want to reintroduce anything, I don't want to rock the boat kind of idea.
Right. Yeah. So the point is, if you're eliminating all those foods, but really eggs are not an issue for you, and you don't really know because you kind of eliminated them all, you want to add eggs back just to see, like if you're the exact same with eggs as you were without, we want you to be, because eggs have a lot of benefits. So we want you to be able to eat those foods. Gluten is not something you're going to reintroduce. Grains are, in my opinion, not something you're going to reintroduce, because those are just inflammatory in general. But with like eggs and let's say nightshades, those might only be inflammatory if you have an autoimmune disease or just a specific person. So that's kind of what she means with like the reason that you reintroduce these foods is you want to eat as much as possible, but you're going to only reintroduce the foods that have nutritional value to you.
Yes.
Yeah. And Alissa, where are you at with diet right now, especially with, how you're managing with everything? Are you eating more of a paleo centered diet as opposed to AIP? Okay. So can you walk us through a little bit of that too?
Yeah, definitely. So I've actually been talking recently that I want to go back to a more stricter AIP kind of template,
Okay.
just to like kind of get my body back together, because I have a little bit of pain at the moment and some injuries that I want to help heal a little bit faster. But yeah, so eventually I was able to reintroduce a lot of stuff. So I reintroduced, coffee was another one that you eliminate, and chocolate. So I reintroduced those two, coffee, chocolate, eggs are fine, nuts and seeds are fine. I found that I can eat a little bit of almonds, but not like a ton of almonds. So I found kind of like that threshold a little bit for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm much more, I would call myself much more paleo than autoimmune protocol at this point. And nightshades are still, they're kind of on that maybe list. I can have a little bit of it, but not like a full blown pizza or something. So, or like spaghetti with tomato sauce, but I can have a little bit, but
Yeah.
Have
And
you had, I'm sorry, Crystal, have
okay,
you
go ahead.
had, so you talked about having like a relapse. Okay. So do you still get relapses now, but just maybe less severe or less often than you did before you put all this into action, which we're going to go a lot more into action steps in a minute. But just out of curiosity, like, does your vision still go blurry ever? Or, you said you have a little bit of pain right now. Like, where are you, like, how does that work?
Yeah. So thankfully, like knock on wood, I have not had a full blown relapse since probably 2014, 2015-ish probably. Because like that's a relapse in MS speak is like kind of active demyelination and just active lesions and like new disability or new symptoms popping up. And I haven't had anything like that, like nothing new. But I do have kind of resurgence of symptoms sometimes, especially in the heat. Heat and MS don't really get along, because a lot of times when we're put in a higher heat situation, a lot of our symptoms come back, unfortunately. So sometimes when it's hot and humid outside, I find that humidity is more so important than heat, but I get some of my sensory symptoms back. My legs feel like molasses. So there's definitely some points where I feel like not so great, but it's not necessarily a full-blown relapse. But I find that like some days I have really bad cognitive days, like word finding I think is my biggest issue, like all the time. So,
okay. Yeah.
But yeah, so I think it's really just dependent on the day, but thankfully I haven't had like an actual relapse yet again.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. And, sorry, Beck.
No, go ahead.
It's a lot to juggle when there's three of us, right? We all want to talk. But with the lesions too, just for listeners, lesions with MS can come and go, right? Can you explain a little bit of that for people who are listening to get a better understanding?
Yeah, definitely. So I don't think necessarily we know a ton about lesions specifically, but so before I saw this video, which I'll talk about in a second, but before I think, and currently I think a lot of doctors put a lot of stake in the annual MRI to like kind of like that's like the be all end all of kind of managing progression and kind of seeing progression and stuff. And that's a good idea. But I watched this video, which was about a study that this guy who has MS, bless his heart, he had an MRI for every 2 weeks for an entire year.
Yeah.
And he said he had no new symptoms, no kind of nothing crazy happening, no relapse, no nothing. But through there was a time lapse video of the MRIs and his brain changing, and lesions were coming and going all the time. And then he felt no differently.
Wow.
So that really changed my view a little bit on MRIs, that they're just kind of a stamp in time. It's not necessarily like this is your progression like this for this year. It's not like it's going to be that way forever either. And so I've had a very large, like not subtle lesion on my brain, and it's not that way anymore. And I don't think it's even there anymore. So I've definitely had some lesions really shrink, some go away. Some of my thoracic spine are still there. But yeah, lesions are really interesting and how they really can come and go. So whenever I have a client who's like, oh, I have my MRI and like freaking out about it, I'm like, well, how about this perspective instead of kind of having the MRI be like be all end all of like how you're doing, like we have to listen to kind of everything, like the patient's experience, like how our symptoms are going, like everything else that we're doing, like to help MS. And it's just interesting how MRIs and lesions, like we can see them like it was like fireworks going off and on. So,
well, it's inactive and active, isn't it? Like the lesions, you can see how if they're active or if they're more just like a steady scar, which would say that they were a little bit older and they're more inactive.
Yeah,
that's my understanding of it.
Yeah, and so like unfortunately to see that, you have to use the contrast and like gadolinium see the activity. So I've tried not to do that. If it's just like a yearly MRI and like I'm just getting a checkup, I don't do contrast anymore. But if I felt like I was having a relapse, I might just to see if depending on my symptoms and stuff.
My dog's going crazy. I don't know if you guys can hear that.
No, not at all.
Oh, good. And I feel like too, maybe one thing that you could take from that is, okay, you have 5 new active lesions. Maybe there's something sparking this, right? So let's get into that. Let's talk about, with every issue, and this is what a lot of people don't understand, and kind of our whole purpose of functional medicine, right? There's always an underlying cause. So we talked about stress. We can even talk more about that if we want, but then what else is there? There's the microbiome, there's different things, right? So why don't we kind of knock these out and give people places that they can understand, like, this is where you need to look. And this is what, maybe you have a new active lesion. So maybe that means you're in mold. Maybe that means that you're in a high stress situation that you need to get out of. And so let's start with the microbiome. Like, what is the connection with autoimmune disease and the microbiome?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because they're finding more and more on this actually, and like the research and stuff, and how MS and like other autoimmune disease obviously can be born, like created kind of from the microbiome, either kind of parasites or like infections in there, or even lack of diversity. So one of the major kind of root causes of MS and autoimmune disease, like in general, is just antibiotic use. Wow. So for me, when I was a kid, I had repeat ear infections. So I was on antibiotics all the time as a kid. Yeah. So I was blowing up and like wiping out my gut and my microbiome like over and over and over again. So it kind of makes sense to me that this was eventually created, kind of like what I was talking about before, of like connecting the dots throughout my life. So I think like the repeated antibiotic use is a big issue. Kind of not having diversity in your diet, which I feel like I'm a little bit guilty of right now because we're in a rut for food. But yeah, like all of those things, because there is like that connection, like the brain gut and gut brain connection, and how it is it's like a two-way street here.
Absolutely.
So however, like what the environment in your microbiome is going to be is going to impact obviously going up and like going to your brain and other parts of your body. So having just a diverse diet, eating tons of vegetables, as many vegetables as possible, all those like fermented foods, like all of those things are obviously a big picture in the microbiome, but that can help symptoms and help disease as well. So.
Yeah. And Beck was mentioning like a lot of these different drivers that we can be thinking about, like our environment, our gut, things like that. And I was listening to another podcast that you were on, and you had mentioned that your mom had Parkinson's. Is that right?
Yeah.
So you were mentioning that you and your mom even made some connections, that you lived maybe near a not so good environment. I don't know if it's through like an industrial plant or something. Yep. Can you kind of explain that? Because that definitely is a thing. Like we see that a lot in the practice with farmers being exposed to so many chemicals, and, there's so many drivers for these things. So yeah, I would love it if you talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is actually a really interesting case study almost, because I'm adopted. So my mom and I do not share any genes, like any like genetic, like anything at all. So that's interesting. But where we were physically, so where my mom grew up, around that area in Ohio, there's a lot of plants, a lot of industrial plants, like a lot of, there's a couple Superfund sites. If you're not familiar with Superfund sites, that's kind of like where the government deems it like not a very good area. So
really, so that's where you guys lived?
Yeah, they're right around there where she grew up, but then I spent a lot of time there because that's where my grandparents were. So I was down there all the time as a kid. So it's interesting how we've kind of made these little connections, because there's been a lot of stories recently about like pesticides and chemicals being involved in Parkinson's. Yeah. So then we looked a little bit deeper and like in the area that we were living in, and we were like, wow, this is possibly a really big root cause for both of us, like a little bit separately, which is interesting.
Wow,
absolutely.
that is. Yeah.
So much to think about with health.
I know. I spent time with someone with MS, and their house was really infested with mold. I smelled it the second I walked in there, but I'm extremely sensitive to mold. And I really think that played a major role in this for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd imagine.
Yeah. So let's talk, about, I saw on your Instagram, you talk about freeze mode. So what is that? And then when that happens, what do we, do to move out of that?
Yeah. So I've been talking a lot about the nervous system lately. So
Mhm.
I'm a therapist also. So I really like to talk about trauma and how that's involved with like creating autoimmune disease and the nervous system, and how that impacts, one, like the development of autoimmune disease, but then two, how we're functioning today. And so in kind of that context, like the nervous system, we have rest and digest, which is parasympathetic, and then sympathetic, which is fight or flight. But then separately, there's a freeze state. You know how everyone kind of lumps fight, flight, freeze all together, but they're actually separate. So fight or flight is like, I'm ready to run from a lion or ready to fight the lion, whatever. So that's kind of like, oh, we're in traffic, we're having to run around like with our kids, like we're dealing with all these kind of things that like fires that we're putting out everywhere, But freeze happens when like all of that is just too overwhelming, and our body and our mind feels like, oh, we have no options for this, so we're just going to go collapse, kind of like freeze collapse, like kind of like a possum, like kind of belly up type thing. So often for kind of how this can look in people is like sitting on the couch and like not really able to get up and move, and they're just like scrolling and just like zoning out to everything, or feeling just literally like unable to get out of bed or something like that. Just kind of your system is on overload and you're just like, oh, all my options are done, so I'm just going to tap out here. So that's kind of a big thing of kind of the chronic kind of fight flight state, but then also jumping into freeze a lot. So it's kind of helping yourself out of both of those are a little bit different, but freeze, you have to get that mobilizing energy again. So I would say even just like getting up and getting a glass of water, like getting up and looking out the window, like just these small little things like that are small, but they're actually quite big in terms of like our nervous system and regulation, and then just getting that energy like to mobilize. And sometimes when we do that, this can also go back, we can push ourselves back into fight or flight, because you have to go into fight or flight to get back to parasympathetic. So there's definitely, so if this is like, if you're listening to this and you're like kind of like, oh my God, this is me. I would recommend like finding someone who's really well versed in the nervous system, who can help you kind of modulate specifically like what you need to do and like what helps you to kind of get out of freeze, but then help to be able to manage the fight or flight energy that's probably going to pop up. And then so you can get back into parasympathetic.
I think a lot of people unfortunately get into sympathetic overdrive, so they get
All
stuck
of
in
us.
that fight or flight.
I say to my clients all the time that like, I have not met yet a person with autoimmune disease who is not a type A perfectionist control freak. And I call myself out here first, because like that's me, and that was me, like, because I haven't found someone who's like a laid back, like, oh, go with the flow, like kind of person who then gets autoimmune disease. It's all of us like type A perfectionists who are holding on like this to either control or whatever, and then we're always living up here, which then obviously kind of has a cascade of effects on our body, which shut down a lot of fundamental processes like digestion, like our microbiome, like is not able to fully like function properly. So there's a whole cascade of issues that happens after that. But that's, I tell my clients, I'm like, we're all in the same boat. We all have to kind of work on this calming down. And it's not necessarily just baths and manicures. There's a lot of like kind of coming up against like really uncomfortable truths or things and patterns, and kind of reshaping and rewiring those that kind of is uncomfortable at times, but it's definitely worth it in terms of progression and like managing your progression and symptom management.
Yeah. I think it's why there's so many videos on YouTube for, parasympathetic activation or vagus nerve toning type of stuff. Because most of the world is stressed. We take on a lot, and then we're not really concerned about how that's affecting our health.
Right.
Then we all of a sudden are knocked down with something like MS, or, there's various things that can happen from the stress response. So really stress is, in my opinion, one of the biggest causes of all disease.
Everything.
Yeah,
it is. I hate it.
I've never met anyone who says they love it.
Right. But I totally agree. After doing all of my years of helping people and coaching, that the common denominator is always stress. Like always some kind of either trauma, like traumatic stress, some kind of overwhelming, like constant stress. But we can do all the diet, we can do the movement, we can do all these other things. But if we're not looking at stress and our own stress response and like where we are in this kind of nervous system continuum, then we're only going to get so far, in my opinion.
Yeah, we're just like a hamster on a wheel, just stuck in
Exactly.
this loop, So for those listening, like that possibly have MS, what are some other neurofocused movements to help with pain and symptoms?
Yeah, definitely. So I like to talk about something I've kind of created. I've joined two different techniques together to call it, I call it slap it to map it. But that starts with a lymph sequence at first to kind of get your lymph fluid moving. You're doing the standing up and you're tapping different areas of your body to get your lymph moving, which also probably will help your parasympathetic and your stress response too, in terms of tapping. But then the slap it to map it part is something where you just basically do this like all around your body, because the brain has maps of where your body is in your brain. Like your brain understands like, oh, the right arm is over here, but sometimes those can get a little bit mixed up, either because of lesions or symptoms or pain or something like injuries, things like that. So helping to reconnect your brain maps to like where your body is actually in space can help your body function better. But it can also kind of take away those like inhibitory and possibly like inhibitory pain that it's creating, because it's like, oh, this is like, we don't really know where your left leg is like per se in space. So we're going to create some hip pain so you don't move it that much.
Okay.
So this can kind of help bridge that gap between like your brain's knowing of where your body is. So it can just take away one more reason that your body's possibly eliciting pain for like no reason. I put no reason in quotation marks, but because obviously there could be some other issues, but that is one of my first steps, like for people to help start to bridge that connection again, to start functioning and fully moving again.
I like that. Yeah.
Go ahead, Beck.
No, you go ahead.
If you could give listeners to like 3 action steps right now, like, if they're struggling with MS, what would it be?
3 action steps. So I'm a fan of really small, like stupidly small steps.
Yeah.
These might sound really simple, but they're really going to go a long way. I think, so 3 steps totally, I would say first, get rid of gluten, because that is just it can just cause so many things. So get rid of gluten. I would say increase your water and make sure that there's like minerals in your water, some kind of electrolytes. So it's fully like, so it's not just water. So there's more nutrients and things in the water.
And you're holding on to it, because people don't realize they're like, I can't be dehydrated. I drink so much water. I'm like, but you're peeing 70 times a day. You got to put electrolytes in there.
Yeah, exactly. So your body can hold on to it a little bit better and use it better.
Yeah.
And so it's not just going right through you. Yeah. So I would say gluten, water, kind of enhance your water. But then also institute, I like to help my clients with this too, is like check-in moments throughout the day. So maybe you do like 2 or 3 alarms throughout the day just to kind of stop, be like, okay, what am I doing right now? What am I doing? How is my body feeling? Where is my attention? Like, where is my mind? Am I present on like, what am I doing? Or am I thinking of a ton of other things? And then what does my body need right now? So I think that would be probably my 3 things of like getting rid of gluten, enhance your water, but then check in with your body a few times a day to see where you're at, to see what's going on, to see what your body needs, so that you can be like, okay, I'm hungry right now, or like, I'm so not focused on what I'm doing. Let me come back to this, and that's how we really start to kind of get out of that chronic fight or flight, is just to be aware of what you're doing and kind of be like, and to challenge or kind of combat that a little bit of like, okay, well, I'm not thinking about what I'm supposed to be doing right now. I'm not being present. So how can I come back to this? How can I come back and ground myself? And that's really the first step of like kind of rewiring all of these like these patterns and these habits that we've gotten into of just like running around everywhere. So
I think it's really, such a great thing to say, to these check-in points. And what most of you will notice if you do that is you're not breathing, right?
Yes.
You're not breathing, or you hold your breath and you're obviously breathing, but you're not breathing these like fluid breaths the way that you should. So I think when you're checking in with yourself, the first thing you should say is, am I breathing?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because breath is a really important in managing stress.
Absolutely. And I feel sometimes like I'm giving like cliche, like, oh, just take a deep breath, like, I feel like that's how it comes across sometimes, but really like you're exactly right. Most of us are like breathing up here, like hyperventilated, like hyperventilation breaths, or like not breathing at all. And like when that happens, then that obviously causes a whole host of issues. Like our muscles aren't oxygenated enough. That causes tension, that causes pain, all of these kind of things. So absolutely, deep breathing is, and you always have it with you. So it's like one of the best tools, even though it sounds so silly, of just go take some deep breaths, but really it's a wonderful built-in way of modulating our nervous system and our health that can have such a drastic impact within seconds. So
yeah, I agree. So one thing that I think is really important when it comes to something like this is, I think a lot of people, when they get a diagnosis of something, and especially something like MS, they can kind of go into denial or maybe just, disbelief and trying to maybe search for what else it could be. What advice would you give on that? And, obviously having a good support system is extremely important. So what advice would you give to people on that?
Yeah. So I was in that camp of like, for a few years, I was like, I don't have this, like, this isn't right, kind of questioning. But then like something would happen and I'd feel a certain way, or like I'd get new lesions and I was like, oh crap. Yep. I do have this. All right, fine. But I think one of the really important things is to not, like, you don't have to bypass those feelings, like the feelings of feeling like betrayed by your body, like denial, anger, all of those are totally understandable and very valid. So I think we have to work through those first to really get to a point of where we're open and kind of in a growth mindset, where we're in a place to be able to kind of wonder, like, okay, what else can I do for this? Because if we're angry about it, mad at our body and kind of doing this in the corner, like, we're not going to want to do anything to help it, So I think we have to move through those emotions first and really feel those, because those are totally valid. Like it's really crappy that we're diagnosed with MS or like anything else, so kind of feeling those first is really kind of how you move through them, but then how you get to that place of being able to implement other things too.
I love that, because we're just on, and this is a totally different topic, but it literally applies to everything.
Yeah.
Feel the feelings, right? We're just talking about this about dating and love, but it also applies to health. If you're upset and you're angry about it, let yourself be that way. It's okay. It's okay to be angry that you have this diagnosis or that you have this symptom. When you push that away, you're not getting rid of it. You're just denying it, right? And it's going to come back up. So in my opinion, let it come up, let it come out, feel it, cry, scream into a pillow, punch a pillow, whatever you have to do. Talk to people about it. Therapy is always helpful, whatever type of therapy works for you. I love somatic therapy, and that type of stuff too. And that's really important because, we talked a little earlier about stress and trauma, and those things store in your body. And if you have an autoimmune disease, and you have things that you have not dealt with emotionally, they are going to make your situation worse, right?
Absolutely.
So we need to learn more as a society, let it out, and not attacking others. Let it out for yourself and let yourself feel it, let yourself say it, whatever you need to do. I think that's a really huge step in getting better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also kind of with that, like of feeling your feelings, like, absolutely. And I think a lot of times if there's trauma and stuff in the past, like some either bad experiences or whatever, that can feel scary to either like your conscious brain or probably even more so your subconscious brain of like feeling those feelings. So that's where, especially with the history of trauma, like working with a trauma therapist, like working with someone who's able to help you actually like feel those feelings in a healthy but safe way. That's really a missing component for a lot of people. They're like, okay, I can feel my feelings, but I don't want to do that because that's scary to me.
Yeah.
So that's where like working with someone can be really helpful in terms of like kind of getting a roadmap on like how to feel those feelings without being totally overwhelmed and then pushing yourself into freeze, like we were talking about before.
That's such an important point. I love that you said that. Yeah.
Do you feel like a lot of that work was a big key turning point in your health? Like, yes, diet, yes, the medications that you're on, because you are still taking medications too right now, right? but all of like the limbic work and the trauma work that you've done, do you feel like that's the big key turning point for you of why you're doing so well today?
I think so. Yeah. And that was probably the last thing, well, definitely the last thing that I did. Cause I was still like, nope, emotions are terrible. Not going to go there. Nope, nope, nope. Until probably the past year or so. And I really started to look at the role that I was playing kind of in perpetuating these like patterns and stuff. And I found that, yeah, like I would like betray myself and kind of bypass my own feelings a lot. So kind of really diving into that and figuring out a few ways for me to modulate my own nervous system and move through emotion myself. I think that's how I've been able to manage, like there's been a couple really big stressors in the past few years, like obviously the pandemic, but then like for us personally, there's been some. So I think, and I starting those, I was like, oh my God, if I get through this without a relapse, I'll be so amazed. But I really did, because I, at that same point, started to kind of really dive into how that lack of really looking at my own emotions was what that was doing to me. So I think that really has been a really big part of my healing and kind of helping everything else to work better.
Yeah. And in me and Becky too, we both practice together, and with many years as we've been doing this and taking care of patients, I mean, stress and trauma, and that is at the forefront of everything. I mean, we can do all the testing, all the work, change our diets, the supplements, but if you're not working on that nervous system and the trauma and things, it can really hold you back and keep you stuck. So if there's one thing that I hope, people take from today, especially with any autoimmune or any health condition, that should be looked at, at the forefront.
Definitely. So you have some things. You have the MS handbook, and then you have what is you told me the other day, it's a really good place for people to start with you.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah. So I have the MS handbook that has a lot of information about diet, movement, stress management, and a few kind of worksheets in there to help you get started. But if that's a little bit overwhelming for you at this point, then I have also a free cheat sheet about kind of the 5 best foods to include in your diet for MS. So that would be a wonderful place for people to start, is just starting like to include one of those foods. Like there's like deep leafy greens, berries, like pretty simple types of foods, but include one of those a week. Like that's where I start with clients, is like, okay, let's add some vegetables to dinner. Let's add some fruit as a snack instead of like your chips or whatever. Let's swap over these little things that really do add up into a lot of things.
Yeah. And so where can people find that information and find more about you?
Yeah. So you can find all of that on my website. So that's www.liss-ms.com.
Love it. And then what's your Instagram handle?
It's liss-ms.
Nice. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We've loved this, and we really appreciate you sharing your story with people. And we know that there's people out there that need to hear this. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. This has been wonderful.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. And if you love this episode, please leave a review. It only takes a couple minutes. And you can find out more about us on drbeckycampbell.com. And you can follow us over at Instagram on @HealthBabesPodcast, @Dr. Becky Campbell, and @Dr. Crystal Hohn. Have an amazing day.